All right, we're gonna start chapter 5, which is on sensation and perception. Before we get started, I am gonna warn you that my cat is in rare form today, and you will probably hear her throughout this lecture. So, in sensation and perception, we're gonna go over the basic concepts of them, and then we're gonna go into vision before we go into the other sentences. The vision will take us the longest. Then we're going to talk about the different interactions of the different senses, and then talk a little bit about ESB, which is perception without sensation. All right, so the basic concepts of sensation and perception. Sensation is the process by which our sensory receptors and nervous system receive and represent stimulus energies from our environment. Our sensation is solely the input that our body receives before it reaches the brain. This is done through sensory receptors, which is our sensory nerve endings that respond to the different stimuli. Perception is the process by which our brain organizes and interprets sensory information, transforming it into meaningful objects and events. This is the process through which we take our sensation, our sensory input, and make sense of it. In order for us to understand sensation, we do that through perception. We do this in a couple of different ways. There's two different ways we do this: bottom-up processing and top-down processing. So bottom-up processing is analysis that begins with the sensory receptors and works up to the brain's integration of sensory information. So that's when we touch something, our sensory receptors take that input in, send it to our brain, and then our brain is able to process that this is what we are feeling. So if we stick our hand under running water, that information is sent to the brain, and it is at that point that it is processed, and we are able to determine if the water that we stuck our hand under is either hot or cold. Top-down processing is kind of the opposite of that. It's information processing guided by higher level mental processes, as when we construct perceptions, drawing on our experience and expectations. So this is kind of like when we see something that is like a substance we don't know, but we perceive it to be sticky. We can look at this and perceive it as sticky based on our previous experiences of what something sticky looks like. And then this leads to our expectation that what we're looking at is sticky. So how does the outer energy, the energy around us, turn into the inner brain activity that is perception? It does this in a 3-step process, and this is done for all of our senses. So first, we receive the sensory stimulation. This is often using specialized receptor cells, especially when it comes to our basic senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and like touch. So those are the basic ones. We receive the outer energy through the specialized receptor cells. Then we transform that stimulation into neural impulses, which we talked about when in chapter 2. And then those neural impulses are delivered to the brain, where we then process it in order to get to the perception. This is done through transduction. Transduction is the changing of one form of energy into another. This is in general, this applies to chemistry, physics, all kinds of other different sciences. In sensation in particular, it's the transforming of stimulus energies such as sight, sounds, and smells into the neural impulses our brain can interpret. This transformation process is what allows us to be able to process our senses, or even to take in those senses to begin with. Without transduction, the sensory information would never be able to reach our brain because it would never have been transformed into the neural impulses to begin with. In order for us to be able to perceive something, it has to really reach a certain threshold. In order for us to consciously perceive something, it has to reach a certain threshold. This threshold is called the absolute threshold, and that is the minimum stimulus energy needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. I find that both the definitions for the absolute threshold and the minimum threshold are kind of confusing, so let me make sure I'm explaining it in a way that you can understand. In order for us to be able to detect something, it has to reach a minimum amount, right? In order for us to hear something, it has to be loud enough for us to hear. But the absolute threshold means that we only need to be able to detect that stimulus 50% of the time. So 50% of the time that a stimulus happens, we can detect it, and that is the absolute threshold. This leads us to subliminal stimuli. So stimuli is the stimuli that happens below our absolute threshold for conscious awareness. So subliminal is anything below our conscious awareness that happens. So what does this mean? It means that the stimuli is happening and our unconscious is picking up on it, but our conscious is not aware of it. So how does that happen? How can we study that? And how does subliminal stimuli affect us? Well, a study was done several years ago where people were shown different images of facial expressions. And prior to the image being shown, another image would flash so fast that the participants were not able to consciously perceive it. This image before was either a picture of kittens or of something friendly or happy like kittens, or something that could be scary or unpleasant like a werewolf. And participants, while not consciously perceiving these images did affect how they would then perceive the next image. If the pleasant image of the kittens was flashed before the image they were grading, they would say that the facial expression of the person that they saw was pleasant, whereas if the unpleasant image or the image of the werewolf was shown, they would say the person seemed unpleasant or unfavorable. And so even though they did not consciously perceive these images of the kitten or the werewolf, it was impacting how they would respond to the image that they did consciously perceive. So this is what's known as priming. Priming is the activation, often unconsciously, of associations in our mind, thus setting us up to perceive, remember, or respond to objects or events in certain ways. This is what subliminal stimuli can do. They can prime us to perceive things a certain way. However, subliminal stimuli cannot persuade us into something. So we can't really use subliminal stimuli to persuade someone into buying something through advertisement. However, we can use subliminal stimuli to prime someone to find the stimuli more pleasant. Or not, I'm sorry, the advertisement more pleasant. So what they're trying to sell more pleasant. So we can't use subliminal stimuli to persuade someone to lose weight, do well on a test, or stop smoking, but we can use it to kind of prime them to find something more favorable. The next threshold that we're going to talk about is the difference threshold. This is also called the just noticeable difference. The difference threshold is the minimum difference between two stimuli required for detection 50% of the time. So in order for us to be able to perceive a difference in stimuli, in two stimuli, we have to be able to perceive it. And when that happens, I'm sorry, my computer is dying. I did not plan ahead enough to plug it in, apparently. So when two stimuli take place, there has to be a difference between the two in order for us to notice the difference. However, in order for it to reach the difference threshold, we only have to be able to notice that difference 50% of the time. So it's the same thing where we don't notice it every time, but we notice it at least 50% of the time. From this difference threshold, let me give you an example of that before we move on. So if we are listening to something at 40 decibels, before we can detect a change in, like an increase in the sound of, say, the music, it has to be increased by a certain number of decibels before we are able to perceive that difference. Now, that isn't a solid number. It's not a whole number. And that's where we get into Weber's law. Weber's law is the principle that in order to be perceived as different, two stimuli must differ by a constant minimum percentage rather than a constant amount. For example, if we are to hold two things in our hands, or if we were to compare two different weights, we picked up one thing that was 5 pounds, and then we picked up another thing that was 10 pounds, we're going to notice a difference in that. Between the two, in the weight between the two objects, because it is noticeable at that point. However, if we pick up something that is 105 pounds and then pick up something else that is 110 pounds, we're not going to notice that different as different. We're not going to notice it as much, and that's because it's not the 5 pounds that's needed to determine the difference threshold. It's it's a percentage. So it's not 5 pounds, it's the whatever percentage it is. I'll give you a few of these percentages. This is not something that you necessarily need to know, but it can help you in kind of understanding it. So two lights have to differ in intensity by 8% in order for us to notice the difference between the two lights. Two objects have to differ in weight by 2%. And so if something is, actually I can't do the math that fast, but that's how much it would need to differ between the two in order for us to notice the difference. And for tones, like in how loud or soft something is, it has to differ by only 0.3%. Actually, I don't think it just says if it's tones as in loud and soft or tones as in like the pitch of something. Yes, what were you eating? Go away. Sorry for that. So those are just some examples of Weber's law and the difference threshold. The next thing we're going to talk about, that is not a toy, please go sleep somewhere, is sensory adaptation. So sensory adaptation is reduced sensitivity in response to constant stimulation. So our sensory our sensory system is alert to novelty. It notices things when things change. So if we bore it with repetition, or if things are unchanging, then we're not going to notice the difference. So an example of that, my cat has a water fountain because she does not drink water that's been sitting still, and I don't notice the sound of it at all because it's a constant sound. The fountain is constantly running. However, when the fountain is beginning to run out of water, there is just a slight change in what it sounds like. There's more of like a hum to it, and then I notice it, and that's how I know when it needs to be refilled. So that's just one example. The one thing that you'll notice with sensory adaptation is that if you think about it, it's like, okay, I can notice when a smell stops going away, right? Your house doesn't smell like anything because you're used to that smell, but other people's houses might smell like something. Hearing something like the water fountain or a fan, that sort of thing. However, with eyesight, that doesn't happen, and that's because our eyes are constantly moving, and if our eyes are constantly moving, then we are constantly getting the novel input of it, the new input from it. So if we stare at something, yes, we're staring at it, but our eyes are just moving microscopically enough that we are perceiving it as new every time our eyes adjust to the new sight. And so that's why it is not something that we can do. That is not something that things do not disappear as we stare at them. So scientists have been able to work around this by attaching like a projector to a contact lens, which I don't even want to begin like comprehending, because the idea of that just creeps me out as someone who wears contacts. But this person did, and when the projection was staying right onto the retina and unmoving despite her eye moving, the image she was seeing did start to disappear. So you can see how that would affect it. So the next slide is going to be the perceptual set. Or did I finish that one? Okay, so the last point is we perceive the world not exactly as it is, but as it is useful for us to perceive it. So it's not useful for me to be able to constantly be aware of my cat's fountain in the background. That's not useful to me, but it is useful for me to know when the sound is different, because then I know I need to refill the fountain. And so things that are the same and not changing, that's no longer useful for us, because we know it's there, we know it to be true. And so as things change, that's when it becomes useful to us, and that's sensory adaptation at work. All right, back to perceptual set. So the perceptual set is the mental tendencies and assumptions that set us up to perceive one thing and not another. The main thing for this is our expectations, and that can influence how we perceive things. And so on page 136 of your textbook, there are a few examples of this. The first being that in 1972, a British newspaper published a photo of the Loch Ness Monster, and everyone was amazed because in this photo, like, you could actually see the Loch Ness Monster, which excited a lot of people and all this stuff. But then if they found that if the picture was shown to someone where it did not say first photo of the Loch Ness Monster, they saw it as either a swan or a log. And so all these people did see the Loch Ness Monster when the photo was first published, but that was because they were told that that's what they should expect to see. Similarly, and the bottom of that page is a little plus sign in one direction. Horizontally it says ABC, but vertically it says 12, 13, 14. So depending on which way you're reading it, Either the middle square says B or 13. So that's context dependent. And they also talked about how the perception of getting French fries in a McDonald's bag versus a plain bag, preschoolers found that the French fries in the McDonald's bag were much tastier despite them coming from the same place. They also did a similar test with beer at MIT that produced similar results. So a part of the perceptual set is dependent on context, motivation, and emotion. So, oh my goodness, sorry, my thing is not working. So context effects. Context effects means that we can experience the same stimuli in different contexts and interpret and perceive the stimuli differently depending on the context. So, some examples of this. When holding a gun, people become more likely to perceive another person as also gun-toting. This leads to shootings of unarmed people and all kinds of other problems with that sort of thing. We can also do this. This also happens like with our auditory senses, where someone can say sects, like different sects of a religion, but some people might hear it as sex. And so depending on the context of the conversation, that would impact how we interpret that stimuli. There are also cultural contexts to take into account. Cultures view things very differently, and so two people can be looking at the exact same thing, but depending on their culture, they might interpret it differently. On page 137 at the top, there's an image at the top that really takes this into account, and I would encourage you to go look at figure 5.6. The next one is motivation. So motivation is what gives us the energy to work towards goals, and this can bias our interpretation of neutral stimuli. So an example of this is desirable objects such as a water bottle viewed by a thirsty person seem closer than they really are. A person who is, you hear the stories of being lost in the desert, and then there's a mirage or an oasis, and people think there's water there, and so they'll go towards that when really it's just like the way the light is reflecting off the sand or something like that. But they perceive it as an oasis because that's what their motivation is. They're wanting to get to where the water is. The last one is emotion. The emotion we experience when experiencing stimuli can influence our perception in one direction or another. So hearing sad music can tilt the mind toward hearing a spoken word as mourning, as in grieving, rather than mourning as in the morning. A hill seems less steep to people who feel others understand them. And when angry, people more often perceive neutral objects as guns. And so another reason that context is, or all these three different context, motivation, and emotion is important to remember when thinking about different situations, both as you experiencing them and as when you look at situations that people acted either differently than you would have or strangely or anything like that. So those are the ways that we can really, or the ways that when we take in stimuli, sensory stimuli. That's the way our brain processes them, but it's important to remember that it's not processed the same way as everybody, and it's not processed the same way in every situation. And this is because the way we process the information, the way we perceive things, is really dependent on the context at the time, our motivation, and our emotions. All important things to remember. So, the next part is vision. The next section we're going to talk about is vision, which is and how we go about processing sensory, or how our vision is processed for both on a sensory level and on a perceptual level. So sensory being like the physical act of getting of the input coming into our mind and our bodies, and then the perceptual processing, how do we interpret it? So, light, energy, and eye structures. So in order to understand how we take in visual stimuli, we have to understand kind of the way the eye is built. This is going to be similar to when we were talking about the brain. I want you to know what the different parts of the eye are, but it's not, you're not going to have to be able to like label the eye or anything like that. Before we get into eye structures, though, let's talk about light energy. Light energy comes in the form of light waves. And so there's a few things that come with light waves. So first is the wavelength. A wavelength is the distance from the peak of one light wave or sound wave to the peak of the next. So on page 139, you're going to be able to see images of a light wave, and then it will also explain the next few things to you. So wavelength is the measurement from one peak to the next of a light wave or a sound wave. Hue is the dimension of color that is determined by the wavelength of light. So how far apart, or how long that wavelength is. So this is what we know as color names, such as blue, green, red, that sort of thing. So the shorter the wavelength means that it has a higher frequency, which is bluish colors. And the longer the wavelength means it's a low frequency, which is reddish colors. So that's hue. Intensity is the amount of energy in a light wave or sound wave, which influences what we perceive as brightness or loudness. The intensity is determined by the wave's amplitude, which is the height. So from the top of the wavelength to the bottom, from the top of the light wave to the bottom of the light wave, that height is what determines intensity. So a greater amplitude, so a bigger difference between top and bottom, is going to be bright colors, and a smaller amplitude is going to be dull colors. So now that we know that that's the type of energy that enters our eye, we have to understand how we take that information in through our eye, and then how it is sent to our brain. So the first part of the eye that we need to know is the retina, and this is the light sensitive inner surface of the eye. It contains the receptor rods and cones, plus layers of neurons that begin processing the visual information. So on page 139 as well, at the bottom, you can see a diagram that might help you begin to understand the eye. If we think of the eye as like a ball that's filled with air, the retina would be the inside of the rubber, if that makes sense. If we're looking at like a rubber ball, the inside is filled with air, but the edge of the inside, that would be the retina, if that makes sense. Within the retina, there are a couple other really important parts. Actually, before we move on from that, there's also the pupil, the lens, the iris, and the cornea, and those are all very important to understanding to how the eye works, but they're not really essential in understanding the transduction of energy and how it works within the brain. And so that's really not what we're going to focus on too much. Just know that the pupil is where the light enters and that the lens concentrates the image onto the retina. Again, you can look at that image on page 139 for the diagram. So on the retina, there are rods and cones, and this is how the light waves are processed. So rods are the retinal receptors that detect black, white, and gray, and they are sensitive to movement. Rods are necessary for peripheral and twilight vision when cones do not respond. Cones are retinal receptors that are concentrated near the center of the retina, and that function in daylight or well-lit conditions. Cones detect fine detail and give rise to color sensations. And so the rods and cones work together in order to form clear images, especially during well-lit conditions. If it is twilight or it is dark outside, our cones do not work as well, and so our rods do take over during that time. The majority of the cones are concentrated near the center of the retina, whereas the rods are more along the outer edges, which makes sense when we consider that they are necessary for peripheral vision, which is our vision on the outer edges of what the visual input is. So that makes sense. The optic nerve is the nerve that carries the neural impulses from the eye to the brain. So the rods and cones concentrate the light and through a process with other cells, which we're not going to include in this because I want to make it more straightforward, change the wavelengths to neural impulses. Okay. These cells are the sensory receptor cells, which we talked about in chapter 2, and they have the axons attached to them. And so those axons make up the optic nerve. And so the axons all come together and they bind together to create this optic nerve that leaves the eye in one spot. And this is the blind spot. This is the point at which the optic nerve leaves the eye, and this part of the retina is blind because there are no receptor cells there, because that is where the bundled axons are leaving the eye. The reason why we don't have a blind spot in our vision is because our eye is once again moving constantly, and because of that, our brain is able to fill in that blind spot based off of expectation and previous information. Let me make sure I got everything. Okay. So this is a very basic understanding, but basically, our The images uses light waves to project an image onto our retina. Our retina takes in this image using rods and cones, and it kind of breaks apart this image into a bunch of little tiny pieces that are then sent through the optic nerve into our brain, where it is then pieced back together. When it does that, it is able to fill in that blind spot. This is like a super basic understanding of that process, but it's what this course expects you to know. So the next part of visual processing is color processing. So in color processing, there are two different theories. There's the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, or trichromatic three-color theory, and then there's the opponent process theory. So in the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory, this is the theory that the retina contains three different color receptors, one most sensitive to red, one to green, and one to blue. And then when it's stimulated in combination, these receptors can produce the perception of any color. That is one theory for it. The opponent process theory is the theory that opposing retinal processes, red, green, blue, yellow, white, black, enable color vision. This kind of falls more along the lines of how we understand color blindness, like there's red, green color blindness, that sort of thing. And so that's more along the lines of the opponent processing theory. When it comes to color, our eyes it's very complex. Seeing in general is very complex, but color is also something that is one of the aspects that makes it complex. So again, for opponent processing theory, it believes that there are opposing retinal processes that enable color vision. And so for example, some cells are turned on by green and turned off by red, and others are turned on by red and off by green. The combination of these is what gives rise to our different colors, the different colors we perceive. Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory basically believes that there are three different types of color receptors, and that the combination of them is what leads to color. One thing when it comes to color is that the color that we perceive is not the color that the object actually is. It's the light waves that are not being reflected by that object, and that's how we perceive the color. And so I apologize for my cat. And so it's another one of the ways that it is just more complicated by I don't even know where I was going for this. It's just another reason why understanding sight is so complicated. All right. So there's a current solution to how color vision works. And it is that color processing occurs in two stages. The retina's red, green, and blue sensitive cones respond in varying degrees to different color stimuli, as the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic theory suggests. The cones responses are then processed by opponent process cells, as Herring's opponent processing theory is proposed. And so just like everything else, it's not one or the other, it's a combination of both. The next part of information processing is feature detection. Feature detection is nerve cells in the brain's visual cortex that respond to specific features of a stimulus, such as shape, angles, or movement. This is how we are able to be able to detect the different features, both like facial features as well as the features of different things, and how we were able to put like a name to something that we're looking at. It's how we're able to identify things and remember what they look like, and then be able to like picture them in our mind later on. So feature detectors are the nerve cells that allow for that to happen. Parallel processing is processing many aspects of a stimulus at once. So we do that by processing a scene's movement, form, depth, and color all at the same time, and then being able to put these together in order to create one image and one understanding of the image. And so if we, on page 144 at the top, there's an image that kind of really shows what parallel processing is. In the first, it's an image of a bird, and in the first image, it shows motion, how we see that, and then it shows the form, which is just an outline of the bird, and then depth, which shows the different, like, how we're able to see which wing is farther away than the one that, which one is closer, and then color. And it's the combination of those that makes it so that we can understand it. And so visual information processing happens kind of in 5 steps. There's the scene that we're processing. Then there's retinal processing, which is when our receptor rods and cones guide the information towards the brain. There's feature detection, which is when the brain's detector cells respond to the specific features, like edges, lines, and angles of the image. Then there's the parallel processing, where brain cell teams process combined information about motion, form, depth, and color. And then we reach the recognition part, where the brain interprets the constructed image based on the information from stored images and is able to see what the image actually is. So when we break it all apart, it seems like a very like long process, when in reality, like, this happens immediately for us. We're able to look at a tiger and be able to say, yes, that's a tiger, I see that as a tiger, without really doing any of these consciously. It's an unconscious parallel processing process. So the next part is perceptual organization. So how do we perceive form? We do this in a few different ways. So there is the figure ground, a way of perceiving form, which is the organization of the visual field into objects, which are the figures that stand out from the surroundings, the ground. And so if you were to look at, a really good way of thinking about this is like when you look at landscape paintings or pictures, you're able to see like what the focus of the image is. Like, if it's an image of a tree in a field, like the figure is the tree. The ground is the surroundings, the sky, the grass, that sort of thing. The other one is grouping, and we do this by, or it is the tendency that we have to organize stimuli into meaningful groups. This is how we've talked about this before. We search to find meaning in things when there isn't necessarily one there, that sort of thing. And so there are 3 principles to grouping. There's the proximity. It's when we group nearby figures together. There's continuity. We perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. And then there's closure. We fill in the gaps to create a complete whole object instead of seeing a bunch of partial objects. On page 145 in figure 5.22, there's some really good images that show those 3 principles. So the next question is, how do we perceive depth? Depth perception is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, although the images that strikes our retina are 2-dimensional, and this is what allows us to judge distance. And so when we first started looking, or when scientists first started looking at depth perception, they used this visual cliff. The visual cliff is a laboratory device for testing depth perception in infants and young animals. They created this platform that, due to the pattern and shading of the platform, it makes it look like it is a cliff. However, it is not. It is a flat surface that is just painted to look that way. And they would have either the child or the young animals try to come, they would try to coax them towards a person on the other side of this visual cliff, to see if the baby or the young animal would do that. And this kind of gave rise to when we were able to figure out, or when humans and other animals develop depth perception. Depth perception has two parts to it. They have the binocular cues and the monocular cues. So binocular cues is a depth cue that depends on the use of 2 eyes. This is mainly done through retinal disparity. So this retinal disparity is a binocular cue for perceiving depth by comparing 2 images from the eyes. The brain computes the distance. The greater the disparity, or the distance between the 2 images, the closer the object. This is one of the ones that is used a lot when it comes to like hand-eye coordination, that sort of thing. So yeah. Monocular cues is a depth cue that is available to either eye alone. So I believe last week I told you guys a little bit about my sister. She only uses one eye at a time. However, both of her eyes work. And so she is able to use the monocular cues in order to perceive depth, but she cannot use the binocular cues. And the binocular cues are really what's important in being able to catch and that sort of thing. So her being able to be the athlete that she is, or was pretty surprising to some of her eye doctors. Let's look more closely at the monocular cues. So the first one is relative height. Relative height is how we perceive objects higher in our field of vision as farther away, because we assume the lower part of the figure ground illusion is closer. So we perceive objects that are higher in our field of vision as farther away. You can kind of see it in the image I attached to this slide, where if you look at the ones that are higher, you kind of perceive them as further back within the image than the ones that are lower. You perceive the ones as lower as closer to you. Relative size. If we assume 2 objects are similar in size, most people perceive the one that casts the smaller retinal image as farther away. And so that's, if we know 2 things are the same size, but one is showing a smaller retinal image than the other, we understand that the one that is smaller is farther away, because we know that those 2 those two objects are the same size. Interposition is if one object partially blocks our view of another, we perceive it as closer. Light and shadow. Shading produces a sense of depth consistent. Let me start again. Shading produces a sense of depth consistent with our assumption that light comes from above. If we understand this because in our experiences, most lights do come above. The sun's above us. Our lights in a room are usually above us. Most of the time, that's how it is. So that is why we perceive it that way. Linear perspective is parallel lines appear to meet in the distance. The sharper the angle of the convergence, the greater the perceived distance. The image on page 147 is a really good example of that. And the last one is relative motion. As we move, stable objects may also appear to move. If while riding on a bus, you fix your gaze on some point, say a house, the object beyond the fixation point will appear to move with you. Objects in front of that point will appear to move backwards. The farther an object is from the fixation point, the faster it will seem to move. So how do we perceive motion? Our brain computes perceived motion based on the assumption that shrinking objects are moving away and enlarging objects are approaching. When large and small objects move at the same speed, the large objects appear to move more slowly. So we process motion in a pretty straightforward way. If it gets bigger, it's coming towards us. If it's shrinking, it's going away from us. It gets a little complicated when large and small objects are moving at the same speed. In general, the larger objects will appear to be moving more slowly. Perceptual constancy is perceiving objects as unchanging, such as having a consistent color, shape, and size, even as illumination and retinal images change. An example of this is color constancy. We see color thanks to our brain's ability to decode the meaning of the light reflected by an object relative to the object surrounding it. And so on page 148, figure 5.26 shows a cube with 3 blue dots and a bunch of yellow dots, and we perceive the blue dots as having different colors despite them all being the same color because we are interpreting the blue color as it relates to the yellow around it. So as the yellow changes, so does our perception of the blue despite it being the same color. Shape and size constancy is how we perceive the form of familiar objects as constant even while our retinas receive changing images of them. If you think of a door opening, we know that a door is always, if we see a door once, we know it's going to be a rectangle and it's going to be the same size every time we see it. And so even though the way we are viewing it might change depending on if it's open, ajar, closed, we're going to know that it's the same size and shape, despite it hitting our retina differently. Perceptual interpretation. So we all interpret our vision differently. And we do this based on our experiences. So the way we perceive things is, like we talked about, it's reflective of our experiences and our expectations. So how does experience affect our visual perception? Well, when vision is restored, for people who were born blind, they had difficulty making sense of the world around them. They might be able to take a cube when they were blind, be able to feel it and identify it as a cube. However, when they regain their vision and they were to see a cube sitting on a table, they would not be able to identify it as a cube because they had never sensed it in that way before. This is because they had never learned how to perceive the sensory input that comes from their eyes. This is because of the plasticity of the brain, the use of neural pathways, and the pruning process. So as they were not using their eyes, those neural pathways began to either weaken, disappear, or be used for something else. Luckily, they are still able to learn these things because of the continued plasticity of our brain. However, the older it is, the harder it will be for them. So what is perceptual adaptation then? Well, perceptual adaptation is the ability to adjust to changed sensory input, including an artificially displaced or even inverted visual field. So we've seen this done in a variety of different experiments. People who were given something that inverted their vision, glasses that inverted their vision, and they were expected to wear them for all day, every day, for a variety of days, would eventually adapt to that change in their vision and would then be able to function normally despite that change. And then upon removing the glasses, they would be able to revert back just as easily. There's also like the slight differences. If you're lying on your side and watching TV, you don't perceive the TV as sideways. You're able to adjust it in your head to be able to perceive it as if you were looking like straight forward at it. So we have a bunch of other senses to go through. Now that we kind of understand how the different, how in general perception and sensation are related, it is easier for us to understand. Sight is the most complicated sense to understand. The second is probably hearing. The rest are going to seem pretty straightforward from this point on. So, hearing. Audition is the sense or act of hearing. So, anything that is auditory is something that you can hear. Audition is the sense or act of hearing. So sound waves have is similar, if not relatively identical to light waves. So frequency is the number of complete wavelengths that pass a given point in a given amount of time. Pitch is a tone's experienced highness or lowness, and it depends on the frequency. So frequency determines pitch, and amplitude or height determines loudness. Decibels is the unit used to measure sound. 0 decibels is the lowest level detectable by human ears. Those are just general things that are important to know in terms of hearing. Just as we go forward. Decibels is how we measure sound, and then frequency, pitch, and pitch are related. Frequency determines pitch. Amplitude, or the height, determines loudness. So decoding sound waves. There are 3 important parts to decoding sound waves. The process begins when sound waves strike our eardrum, and this causes the tight membrane of the eardrum to vibrate. The middle ear is the chamber between the eardrum and the cochlea, and it contains 3 tiny bones that help concentrate the vibrations of the eardrum on the cochlea's oval window. So the middle ear picks up the vibrations of the eardrum and transmits them to the cochlea. The cochlea is a coiled, bony, fluid-filled tube in the inner ear. Sound waves traveling through the cochlear fluid trigger nerve impulses. The inner ear is the innermost part of the ear. It contains the cochlea, the semicircular canals, and the vestibular sacs. So the vibrations of the eardrum cause the cochlea's membrane covered opening to vibrate. This sends ripples through the fluid, and the ripples bend the hair cells that line the membrane of the cochlear surface. The hair cells' movement in turn triggers impulses in the nerve cells, whose axons combine to form the auditory nerve. So, sound waves enter the middle ear. The middle ear concentrates those sound waves onto the cochlea. The cochlea then, the vibrations then cause the fluid in the cochlea to vibrate, which bends the hair cells, which then trigger the nerve impulse. That is then sent to the brain. Again, very simplified. I want you to really just know what the middle ear is, what it contains, what the cochlea is, and what the inner ear is. So, how does hearing loss work in this type of situation? Well, there are two primary types of hearing loss. The first is sensory neural hearing loss. This is hearing loss caused by damage to the cochlear's receptor cells or to the auditory nerve. This is the most common form of hearing loss. Okay? The other is conduction hearing loss, and this is a less common form of hearing loss caused by damage to the mechanical system that conducts sound waves to the cochlea. The cochlear implant is a device for converting sounds into electrical signals and stimulating the auditory nerve through electrodes threaded into the cochlea. So these are the two most common types of hearing loss. So nerve deafness is sensory neural hearing loss. Nerve deafness cannot be reversed. So this is how this is when a cochlear implant would be applicable. A conduction hearing loss can be reversed, I believe, in some cases. However, a cochlear implant, I believe, would also work for this. So how do we locate sounds? We are able to locate sounds due to the fact that we are experiencing two sets of auditory input, one from the left ear and one from the right. We take those two different inputs of those two sensory inputs and are able to determine where a sound is coming from based on how loud or soft something is. If the input that comes into my right ear is louder than the input that's coming into my left ear, then I know that the sound is from my right. If they're the same, like my cat's meowing right now, I know that she's right in front of me, demanding attention. Yes, now go away. Oh, stop. Sorry. All right, the next sense we're going to talk about is touch. And with touch, we've really talked a lot about touch already in chapter 2. And so we're not going to go into that, but we are going to talk about pain and how we can understand pain. So what are some of the biological influences of pain? So pain is it uses both top-down and bottom-up So it uses what we are actually feeling and then our expectation of what we are feeling. So what are the biological influences? Pain is produced by our senses. There is no one type of stimulus that triggers pain or sensory receptors that triggers pain, and there are no sensory receptors that specialize in pain signals. Pain comes from all of our sensory receptors that then send the information to our brain that then tell us that we are experiencing pain. It is not one specific type of stimulus or one specific type of sensory receptor that does this. It can be felt from all of our, based off of all of our senses. Psychological influences. One powerful psychological influence of our perception of pain is the attention we focus on it. The more attention we focus on our pain, the more we are going to be able to feel the pain. If we are able to ignore it, then it's not as bad. For example, if I have a headache at work, and we're busy, I don't notice it as much. However, as soon as have a lull in our time, or we have a moment to just sit for a second, then I notice the pain again. And it doesn't necessarily go away just because I'm busy, but I'm not focusing on it. It's not the only sensory input I'm experiencing, right? And so that's one example of that. We also edit our memories of pain. And so this can either lessen our memory of the pain, which is less likely, but it can also increase it. When we are little, we remember the immunizations we get as a lot more painful than they actually were, which can contribute to our fear of immunizations. However, if I was the kid that like did not like shots when I was growing up, and I had like this terrible fear of them, and I still don't really like them. I still remember them as being very painful. However, when I get tattoos, I don't remember any pain associated with that, which is interesting considering that's literally being poked with a needle a bunch of times. And so I have edited my memories of pain based off of like the after effects, right? There are also social cultural influences, so we tend to feel more pain when others also seem to be experiencing pain. This can also be shared pain and a part of mirror neurons and stuff like that, which we will talk about more in the next chapter, I believe. It might not be till chapter 7. So how can we control pain? Well, there's a few different ways. There are placebos. So placebos can help by dampening the central nervous system's attention and responses to painful experiences. The expectation alone can help. We've talked about placebos before, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this. There's also distractions. When endorphins combine with distractions, amazing things can happen, according to the book. So if we focus on something else, then that can distract us from the pain that we are experiencing. It's also one of the things that I recommend a lot to people who are experiencing panic attacks and that sort of thing, is distraction. It seems a little weird, like, oh, you're just putting off like dealing with it, but in the moment it can be the most effective thing, because you're not going to be able to deal with it if you're in the midst of a panic attack to begin with. So the next is hypnosis. So hypnosis is a social interaction in which one person, the hypnotist, suggests to another person, the subject, that certain perceptions, feelings, thoughts, or behaviors will spontaneously occur. So some people believe in hypnosis, other people don't. we're not going to really talk too much on our beliefs on it, but there are two different theories on why it might work. The first is the social influence theory. And this theory believes that hypnosis is a form of social influence, and is a byproduct of normal social and mental processes. In this view, people believe that hypnotized people begin to feel and behave in ways that are appropriate for good hypnotic subjects. So they may allow the hypnotist to direct their attention away from the pain in order to be a good hypnotist subject. The other is the dissociation theory, and this proposes that hypnosis is a special dual processing state of dissociation, which is a split between normal sensation and conscious awareness. This theory tries to explain why, when no one is watching, hypnotized people may carry out hypnotic suggestions that are made during the hypnosis process. It also offers an explanation for why people who are hypnotized for pain relief may show brain activity in areas that receive sensory information, but not in areas that normally process pain-related information. There's also the belief that selective attention may be at work. Post-hypnotic suggestions are suggestions made during a hypnosis session to be carried out after the subject is no longer hypnotized. This is used by some clinicians to help control undesired symptoms and behaviors. This is one of the ones that is just... It's one of those things when people ask me when I'm at work if they should try hypnosis, I tell them it's worth a shot, mostly because people who are at that point usually are willing to try anything because nothing else has worked in the past. So I'm never going to tell someone, no, don't try hypnosis if they think it will help. However, it's not something that I would necessarily practice myself. The next one is taste. Gustation is our sense of taste. Taste is our first chemical sense, and it does not take a lot of stimuli to trigger taste. There are 5 different taste sensations: sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami, which is savory. And each of the different types of tastes have a survival function. So a sweet taste usually indicates an energy source. A salty taste indicates the presence of sodium, which is essential to physiological processes. A sour taste usually indicates a potentially toxic acid. A bitter taste indicates potential poisons. And umami, or savory, usually indicates that there are proteins present, which are important in growing and repairing tissue. Taste can also be highly influenced by smell. And so we do have lots of taste buds. So we have little bumps all over our tongues, and each bump contains 200 or more taste buds. Each taste bud contains a pore that catches food chemicals and releases neurotransmitters, which are then sent to our brain and is how we perceive taste. Taste receptors reproduce themselves every week or two. So if we burn our tongue, it doesn't really matter and won't affect our taste long term. You need to be quiet. I am trying to work. So if we burn our tongue, it doesn't really matter because within a week or two, the taste receptors will have reproduced themselves. The next one is smell. So smell is also a chemical sense, and it is also a primitive sense. It's one of our very basic primitive senses. Smell is not as strong as of a sense as our other senses. However, it does hold a lot of weight because it is the only sense that has a direct line to where it is processed in the brain. Every other sense has to go through the thalamus, which is the brain's sensory control center, except for smell, which is why smells can trigger memories and reactions so much more quickly than some of our other senses. We also have some other senses. We're not going to go into a lot of the other ones, but we are going to talk about these two. They are kinesthesia and our vestibular sense. So kinesthesia is our movement sense. It's our system for sensing the position and movement of individual body parts. It's how we know where in space our body is located, where in space our hand is. It's what enables us to be able to reach out and touch something without fumbling all over ourselves. We also have our vestibular sense, which is our sense of balance. So kinesthesia, our sense of body movement and position, enables our sense of balance, which is a part of our vestibular sense. So those are just two examples of some of the other senses we have. Our senses are not limited to the 5 that we normally think of. It can include it includes a lot of other stuff as well. Those are just two of the more common ones. So sensory interaction. What is sensory interaction? Sensory interaction is the principle that one sense may influence another, as when the smell of food influences its taste. So an example of this is the way smell and taste interact. If we were to plug our nose and blindfold ourselves and be fed different types of food, we might have a harder time being able to identify those foods based off of our taste alone. Sensory interaction is what really gives us the ability to be able to really understand our different senses, and the interaction of the different senses is really what promotes our ability to understand the world around us. Embodied cognition is the influence of bodily sensations and judgments, and how bodily sensations can affect how we then interpret other things within our mind. So judgments may mimic body sensations. So sitting at a wobbly desk and chair can make relationships seem less stable. It can also cause people to be less confident in taking an exam or something. Physical warmth may promote social warmth. After holding a warm drink rather than a cold one, people were more likely to rate someone more warmly, feel closer to them, and behave more generously. On days when people feel physically warm, they feel socially warm and friendly. So yeah. The last little bit here for sensory interactions is something called synesthesia. This is where one sort of sensation, such as hearing sound, produces another, such as seeing color. I have a friend who experiences this. So when she hears different words, she also experiences seeing color associated with those words. But that is more of a common example There's also people who, depending on like the tone or the pitch of something, will see color. You can also like, there are people who will taste something when they hear sound, and so, which I think would be kind of awful, especially if there was one that had a particularly bad taste. But that is just one way that this happens. It's a common belief that that synesthesia might be something that everybody experiences, especially when they're younger, and that most people grow out of, but some don't. So if you are looking for a place that summarizes all of the senses, there is a table 5.3 on page 160 that kind of goes over all of the ones that we've talked about this far. The last one we are going to talk about is ESP, and I realize now that I did the labeling of this backwards because it is perception without sensation, not sensation without perception. So I will try and remember to fix that. So what is ESP? ESP is extrasensory perception. This is the controversial claim that perception can occur apart from sensory input. This can include telepathy, clairvoyance, and precognition. And so scientists are hesitant to believe in ESP due to the inability to scientifically test it. So ESP is something that some people agree with, some people don't. It's all kind of this really gray area because there's no way to 100% prove that it exists. And so people will either believe it or they won't. So some common types of ESP are telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, like being able to talk to someone in your mind. Clairvoyance, which is being able to perceive remote events. And precognition, which is perceiving future events. And so those are just some examples of those. We're not going to go too much into it. I might ask you like what telepathy is or what clairvoyance is, but that's going to be really the extent. Or I might ask you why scientists don't necessarily believe in ESP, that sort of thing. I'm not going to go too far into this because the real meat of what I want you to know is all the other senses that we've been talking about. So that is the end of what I have for chapter 5. If you have any questions, email me, send me a message on Canvas, whatever you need. I will be happy to spend time making sure everybody understands the material.